Imagine you're part of an expedition climbing one of the most dangerous islands on Earth. After hours of searching, you notice something moving in the darkness. At first, it doesn't seem unusual, until the scientists around you suddenly freeze, because what you're looking at isn't just another animal. According to science, this species wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It had been declared extinct decades ago. So, how could it possibly be alive? As impossible as that sounds, this is a true story. And to understand how something like this could even happen, we have to travel to one of the strangest places on the planet. Rising straight out of the Pacific Ocean is a massive pillar of rock known as Ball's Pyramid. At 562 meters tall, it's the tallest sea stack on Earth, standing completely isolated in the middle of the ocean. From a distance, it almost looks like a giant stone blade piercing through the water. It's so steep and unforgiving that for most of history, people believed almost nothing could survive here. Ball's Pyramid lies about 23 kilometers away from Lord Howe Island, a much larger island that was once home to an incredible variety of plants and animals found nowhere else on Earth. Because these islands remained isolated for millions of years, life evolved here in ways that were completely different from the rest of the world. Species had no need to defend themselves against many predators because those predators simply didn't exist. Over thousands of generations, a delicate ecosystem formed where everything depended on that isolation remaining untouched. It was a balance that had survived for centuries. But all it took was one unexpected event to change everything forever. That event happened in 1918, when a ship called the Macombo accidentally ran aground near Lord Howe Island. The accident itself wasn't what caused the disaster. Hidden aboard the ship were black rats, and once they escaped onto the island, the damage began almost immediately. On continents, rats are just another animal competing for food. But on isolated islands, they become something far more destructive. They raid nests, eat eggs, attack young animals, and wipe out species that have never evolved to defend themselves against predators like them. Within just a few years, Lord Howe Island began losing wildlife at an alarming rate. Animals that had survived there for thousands of years suddenly found themselves fighting a battle they were never prepared for. Scientists watched native species disappear one after another as the rats spread across the island. Among them was one particular species that seemed especially vulnerable. By 1920, not a single living individual could be found. Expedition after expedition searched for it, but every search ended the same way. With nothing. Eventually, scientists accepted what seemed unavoidable. The species was officially declared extinct. As the decades passed, that decision became accepted as fact. Museum collections preserved a few old specimens. Scientific books listed it as gone forever, and future generations grew up believing they were looking at the remains of an animal that no longer existed anywhere on Earth. The case appeared completely closed, or at least, that's what everyone believed. Then, more than 40 years later, something happened that nobody could explain. In 1964, a climber exploring Ball's Pyramid stumbled upon a single dead specimen that looked remarkably similar to the supposedly extinct species. It wasn't alive, so it couldn't prove the species still existed. But its presence raised an uncomfortable question. How had the remains of an extinct creature ended up on one of the most inaccessible rocks on the planet? Suddenly, a mystery that had been forgotten for decades was alive again. At first, most people dismissed it as nothing more than an interesting coincidence. One dead specimen wasn't enough to overturn decades of scientific evidence. Maybe it had been carried there by birds. Maybe storms had washed it ashore. Maybe it had arrived through some completely unknown event. But for a small group of researchers, that single discovery refused to make sense. And the more they thought about it, the more one impossible question refused to go away. What if extinction wasn't the end of the story? What if everyone had simply been looking in the wrong place? The forgotten mystery refused to stay buried. That dead specimen found in 1964 had raised far more questions than it answered. If the species had truly disappeared decades earlier, Then how did its remains end up on Ball's Pyramid? Was it simply a coincidence? Or was there still something alive somewhere on that towering wall of rock? The idea sounded almost ridiculous, but once that possibility entered scientists' minds, it became impossible to ignore. They knew there was only one way to settle the mystery. They had to search the island themselves. That was easier said than done. Ball's Pyramid isn't the kind of place where you simply step off a boat and start hiking. Its towering volcanic walls rise almost vertically out of the ocean, with waves crashing endlessly against its base. Even reaching the island is difficult, but moving across it is another challenge entirely. At certain points, the expedition had to carefully cross narrow ledges, stretching hundreds of meters along the cliffs. In some places, those ledges narrowed to just a few centimeters wide. One wrong step wasn't something you could recover from. For years, very few people were even allowed to climb Ball's Pyramid. The island is both environmentally fragile and incredibly dangerous, so access remained heavily restricted. But in February 2001, a team from the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service was finally given permission to investigate the mystery properly. Their goal wasn't to prove the species had survived. In fact, many expected the expedition to do the exact opposite. They believed this search would finally put the rumors to rest once and for all. The team spent the entire day exploring the steep cliffs, carefully examining every crack, ledge, and patch of vegetation they could safely reach. Hours passed, with nothing to show for it. There were no signs that anything unusual lived there. As the daylight slowly faded, it began to look like the journey had confirmed exactly what everyone had expected all along. Maybe the dead specimen from 1964 really had been nothing more than an unexplained coincidence. But then, one tiny detail changed everything. While searching one small area, the team noticed something unusual beneath a lone shrub growing from the rocks. Scattered around its base were tiny droppings that didn't seem to belong to birds or any of the other animals known to live there. On their own, the droppings didn't prove anything, but they were enough to make the scientists hesitate. Instead of ending the search, they made a decision that would completely change the outcome of the expedition. Rather than leaving, 2 members of the team returned after nightfall, carrying only flashlights. The climb became even more dangerous in complete darkness, but there was a reason for taking the risk. They suspected that if anything had managed to survive on Ball's Pyramid, it might only emerge at night when temperatures were cooler and conditions were less harsh. Carefully, they stepped back onto the narrow ledges and made their way toward the same lonely shrub. The ocean roared hundreds of meters below as their light swept slowly across the rocks. For a few tense moments, nothing happened. Then, one of the flashlights caught the slightest movement among the leaves. Something was climbing through the branches. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't another bird. It was exactly the kind of discovery nobody had expected to make. Sitting quietly on that isolated shrub was a living member of the species everyone believed had disappeared forever. After more careful searching, the team found not just one, but 3 living individuals, 2 adults, and a young one, feeding together in complete silence. It was one of the rarest wildlife discoveries of the century. The species had survived unnoticed for more than 80 years on one of the most isolated pieces of rock on the planet. But that incredible discovery immediately created another mystery. How could an entire species survive for decades on what looked like nothing more than a giant pillar of bare volcanic rock? And when the scientists searched more carefully the following year, the answer turned out to be even more unbelievable. Finding a living member of a species that had been declared extinct wasn't enough on its own. Scientists knew that if they announced such an extraordinary discovery without proof, very few people would believe them. So, they turned to DNA, comparing genetic material from the newly discovered population with preserved museum specimens collected decades before the species disappeared. The results left almost no room for doubt. The mysterious survivor was genetically the very same species that had been declared extinct more than 80 years earlier. And now, we can finally answer the question we've been holding on to since the beginning of this video. The mysterious survivor wasn't a dinosaur, a bird, or some giant mammal hidden on an isolated island. It was the Lord Howe Island stick insect, a large, glossy black insect often nicknamed the tree lobster because of its unusual size and appearance. For more than 80 years, the world believed it had completely disappeared after rats invaded Lord Howe Island in 1918. Yet somehow, against every odd imaginable, this remarkable insect had survived in complete isolation on Ball's Pyramid, turning it into one of the greatest Lazarus species discoveries ever recorded. But perhaps the most unbelievable part wasn't what scientists found. It was where they found it. When researchers returned to study the population more carefully, they discovered that the entire wild population was surviving around just a handful of tea tree shrubs growing from cracks in the cliff face. They counted only 24 individuals spread across a few neighboring plants. Imagine that for a moment. An entire species that once lived across an island was now surviving on what was essentially a tiny patch of vegetation clinging to the side of the world's tallest sea stack. It wasn't just surviving in isolation, it was surviving in one of the smallest and most fragile habitats imaginable. That discovery immediately created another problem. A single disease, one powerful storm, or even a rockfall could wipe out the entire species forever. Scientists couldn't simply leave its future to chance, but removing too many individuals could be just as dangerous. So they made an extraordinary decision. They collected only 2 insects, one male and one female, and carefully transported them to Melbourne Zoo. It sounds unbelievable, but at that moment, the future of an entire species rested on just those 2 tiny survivors. Against all odds, the breeding program worked. The pair successfully produced offspring, which later produced offspring of their own, slowly rebuilding a population that had once stood on the edge of extinction. Today, conservationists care for hundreds of tree lobsters, along with thousands of carefully protected eggs. What began with only 2 rescued insects has become one of the world's most remarkable conservation success stories. It proves that sometimes saving a species doesn't require thousands of animals. Sometimes it begins with just 2. The story, however, still had one final chapter waiting to be written. For decades, there was no point returning the tree lobster to Lord Howe Island because the very animals that had driven it to extinction were still there. But in 2019, after years of planning, conservationists launched one of Australia's largest island restoration projects, successfully removing the invasive black rats from Lord Howe Island. Almost immediately, native plants and wildlife began recovering. For the first time in more than a century, the island was finally becoming safe enough for its long-lost resident to return. And perhaps that's what makes this story so extraordinary. Ball's Pyramid looked like nothing more than a lonely pillar of volcanic rock rising from the Pacific Ocean. Yet hidden among a handful of windswept shrubs, it quietly protected a species the world believed had vanished forever. What scientists thought was the end of a story turned out to be nothing more than a missing chapter. Sometimes, extinction isn't the moment a species disappears. It's simply the moment humanity stops looking. And in this case, nature had been protecting one of its greatest secrets all along.